introduction, Helena. I'm thrilled to be co-hosting tonight's conversation on the intersection of climate action and climate justice. I just have a few thank yous before starting. Enormous appreciation for my co-hosts this evening, Slow Down Media, Andrew Zuckerman, Spencer Bailey, and the rest of the team. We're in their space tonight. I want to thank Casey Rogers for being super instrumental in shaping and supporting this event, and Robert and Barney Swan, who catalyzed it. Very lucky to have them here with us tonight. I would love to invite Rob up to say a few words and kick this off the way only Rob can. For those who are unfamiliar, Rob was the first person to walk to both the North and the South Poles. Since then, he has inspired a battalion of climate advocates through the portal of Antarctica, which is where Flavia and I met on Rob's watch. He founded the 2041 Foundation to extend the protections that govern Antarctica and prevent the exploitation of Antarctica's critical ecosystem. His 50-year commitment to this mission has imbued him with rare perspective on the power of horizontal climate leadership. Rob, can you come up here? Join me.
Well, I'll be very, very brief. It's a real honor to be here, it really is. And Flavia, we're so proud of you. And I just want to say something I've always tried to live by and failed dismally, but I keep trying. And that is that if you can do or dream you can, begin it now. For boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. And tonight is all about magic. It's all about turning inspiration into hope, and hope into inspiration, those two words. And my mum and my son's grandmum recently passed on at 106 years and 4 months, so she had a pretty good run at it. And she always said to me a simple thing, that women have the power. And she was always right. And I believe that what's happening this evening is a celebration of what's possible to achieve. I think we spend most of our lives being told what's not possible to achieve. And to see what you're doing, Flavia, in your part of the world, what my son Barney's doing in the rainforest in far north Queensland, pretty rough places. I think that those things are really important to inspire a generation, whether we like it or not, who are starting to give up, starting to look at the world and say, is there any point in us actually bothering to move things forward? So I think tonight is such a great example of showing that there is hope. And if we've got people like you and people like everybody else that's here this evening, I feel hopeful. So thank you very much for allowing me to kicked off officially.
Thank you, Rob. I'm so honored to be a part of Rob's 2041 family. It's a gift that keeps on giving, for sure. I'd like to invite Flavia and David up to join me for the main event. It is my supreme pleasure and privilege to introduce you both this evening. David is the president of the Obama Foundation. Before that, he served in President Obama's administration, first as deputy assistant to the president, working with senior advisors David Axelrod and David Plouffe, and later as the White House Director of Political Strategy and Outreach. He is a lifelong public servant, a former community organizer, and a passionate advocate of leadership that listens first. And thank you, David, for being here. And Flavia is a powerful example of exactly this kind of leadership. She is an Obama Scholar and a Dalai Lama Fellow. She holds a PhD in urban planning and acts as a global consultant and speaker on climate change and social justice for institutions including the UN, Columbia University, and the Brazilian Center for Climate. Her NGO, Fila de Sol, seeks to regenerate nature throughout the tropics while increasing climate justice, including gender justice. Thank you, Flavia. I want to start very simply with you, Flavia, and I want to ask you, what does it mean to you to be an Obama Scholar, and how has it inspired the work you're doing through Fila de Sol?
Thank you for your question, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for being here. I welcome you all in this place, in this time. And I usually start my conversations with this deep breath, because it helps me and it helps us to ground ourselves and to remember that there is a world outside, but now we are here together. So let's honor this moment. What does it mean to be an Obama Scholar? What a good question. First and foremost, I think it means being audaciously hopeful. And I grew up with dad who was very audacious and very hopeful. And I would see by his bedside this book called The Audacity of Hope. So this was something that it was always part of the way that I was raised. And my dad would remember that when we have this dream of transformation that it seems too big for us, we can do it anyway. And there are people who are already doing it, like President Obama. It was the example that he gave me. So I think when I applied to be an Obama Scholar, I had the sense that hope is not naive, is not wishful thinking, it's not empty. On the contrary, you need to be very strong to be hopeful. It's much easier to be hopeless. And this hope rooted in action is what I learned and keep learning with the Obama Foundation community. And this action, from my perspective, is community action. Because as Obama Scholars, we don't learn how to be presidents. We learn how to organize our communities, how to change our world. So I think the practical aspect of it is now that I am part of this network of more than 800 leaders in more than 100 different countries, and we share these values. Because hope is a value in our leadership, and when you feel that you are working in this big issue, climate change, and you're not isolated, you're not the only one, things get a bit less overwhelmed. So I feel that being Obama Scholar is being part of a community of audacious hope.
Yes, and I have heard you say that before, that you don't learn to be presidents, you learn to be community organizers. And David, to me and through my conversation with you, it just seems to cut to the core of what the Obama Foundation, the work that you do. And I'd love to know if you could speak to the Obama Foundation's mission and how it's embodied in Flavia and leaders like her.
Erica, thank you. And Flavia, when she was describing what it meant to her, I'm a fairly emotional guy anyhow, and I couldn't help but well up. It was December of 2016, so it's about a month after the November election in 2016. And the president asked me to come into the Oval. I'm the son of two Portuguese immigrants with a fourth grade education, and there I am serving the president of the United States. Never gets old to walk into that office. And on that day, when he began to describe the journey, he said, imagine if we can spend the next 50 years finding the most extraordinary young leaders on the planet and connecting them together in a way that has never been done at the scale that is required to solve the problems that the planet faces. We're not going to tell them what to do or what to focus on. We're going to bring them together, connect them to each other, give them some very basic community organizing, citizen engaging training, and then let them loose on the planet. The easiest way to think about it is, what does the planet look like if in the next 10, 15, 20 years, there are 10,000 Flavias connected together in a way that's never been done before? And so what I want all of us to, as we hear Flavia talking about the work that she does, it goes back to essentially first principles. In 2017, Barack Obama was on the stage in Johannesburg, and it was the commemoration of Mandela's 100th birthday. And we had selected 200 people out of an applicant pool of 23,000. Images of Mandela behind a stadium of 50,000 people. This young South African woman who was in our cohort says, I want to introduce to you the former president of the United States. He walks onto the stage, and again, imagine the image in Joburg with Madiba behind him. And the message was as follows. Madiba was an ordinary person who came together with other ordinary people and changed the world. I have been fortunate to come together with other people to make my country and the world hopefully a little bit better. And then he looked at the 200 in front, and they all had t-shirts that said, we are the ones. Change doesn't come when you wait for one person or one moment. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are the change that we seek. And so Flavia and her colleagues, 800 now, but from this point forward, we will be selecting 500 to 600 Flavias every single year and connecting them together. So in 10 years, we will have created the largest network of civic change makers connected together that this planet has seen, and 15% of every class we have selected is doing work on climate. That's the potential in the promise. But again, all focus on my colleague and partner here, Flavia. So thank you for that question, Erica.
That makes me feel as if we are in very, very good hands. I remember meeting Flavia for the first time, and I was telling you just before we sat down, she created a sea change in sentiment, in dialogue, just with a few very generous words and clear intention and a passion for the work that she was doing in her region of the world, and thoughts towards how we could connect that to the greater mission. And the intersection between the overarching climate conversation and the climate conversations that are bubbling up from the ground. And I think that you both have very different perspectives on the climate crisis. David, I would characterize yours as the 30,000-foot view. And Flavia, you are in the eye of the storm, really on the ground. And I'm curious to know, from these vantage points, what's working well? David, let's start with you.
So what's working well 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and all of you in this room understand and appreciate this. A global, government-wide, industry-wide perspective around climate change did not exist in terms of acknowledgement that there is a problem. So one, when you're facing any problem, even with deniers who are just part of the world, there is an acknowledgement and concerted action. Not enough, but there's concerted action. I remember vividly the March for Us up to Paris and all of the steps that had been taken for 5 years to align everything to get to that moment with the Chinese, with the Indians, with a variety of other people to say, here is a moment now where we can move this in a way that was unexpected. That is progress. While that was going on, there was an entire universe of tech individuals, corporations, foundations, financial actors who were saying, we are going to begin to measure what we do against these standards, and it's a requirement and an imperative that we have. That's progress that wasn't existing 10 to 15 years ago. And if you look at different baseline assessments compared to worst case scenarios, which is hard to do, but we need to look critically at what's in front of us, compared to the trend lines 7, 8, 9 years ago, those worst case scenarios are not the trajectory that we're on now. That's not a moment to pull back. It's a moment to be grounded in what Flavia was talking about, hope, not being naivete, but saying, okay, where are we? And based upon the progress that we've made at a macro level, where can we go? Here's the gap. While you have these macro movements that are still falling short in many ways, the work that Flavia and many of her colleagues are doing is the last mile. That's forgotten, that's ignored in a variety of reasons, in a variety of regions, and in the United States. One of the things that I'm cognizant of, especially at a 30,000-foot level, in a democracy, even if we believe that this challenge is self-evident and clear, the responsibility is to persuade and to engage. Even if you have done it repeatedly, the imperative is to engage and persuade. And so, two very different challenges at the ground level, but let me use that as a transition to Flavia.
Thank you. Okay, so to give a little bit of context, because some of you might know, but others don't know, that I am from the Brazilian Northeast. In the Brazilian Northeast, there's a global climate hotspot, meaning that we face many challenges, environmental, social, political, economic challenges, and that basically we are part of this thing that is called frontline communities. And frontline communities are those who feel the impacts of climate change first and the most. So for us, climate change is about limiting global warming to 1.5 Celsius degrees, and also about very concrete and personal challenge that we face every day. So it's not abstract. It's about people. It's about when it doesn't rain enough, we will not have water, because we need rain to have water, because we don't have basic sanitation. There's no sewage. So I feel that climate change is this global problem with these hyper-local manifestations. And it manifests differently. It can be desertification in one area. It can be sea level rising in other area. So locals are very aware of climate change, although sometimes they do not refer to as this challenge, this daily challenge, as climate impacts. Unfortunately, the climate conversation is very exclusive. It excludes a lot of people, including people in my community. So for me, even for me, I am a white, Latina, middle class, and I speak English. Even for me, the Climate Week has been intimidating sometimes and overwhelming sometimes. So how we make sure that these problems, lack of water, lack of basic sanitation, agriculture productions that are decreasing, how we make sure that all of this is named as climate impact so people can understand that what they are doing there, basically surviving and holding the front lines of climate crisis, is climate action. And they are leaders. If they are protesting against deforestation, if they are educating kids, this is climate leadership. So I feel what's working, it's that people are already climate leaders in the front lines. So we need to give them the resources and the recognition and connect them in a way that they are part of this shared mission. Because sometimes when I go to a frontline community and I see everyone is doing their part, but they are isolated, they have no awareness that there is such thing called climate finance, that they can access these resources. So I feel sometimes it's like, there is an expression that you use in English, it's rolling a stone uphill. In Portuguese we say drying ice. Like this constant work of enxugar gelo. So I feel what can work better is to connect these people, and they understand themselves as leaders, as climate leaders. They can work as a community. The community is already there. The sense of community is so strong. So how we can make sure that these communities together are connected as a coalition, as a climate coalition. So basically, what I think we can do is to do this community organizing at a global scale, at the scale that matches the magnitude of the problem that we are facing. Because climate change is a global problem, it needs a global solution, but it doesn't mean that it needs an uniform solution. It's not the same solution everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, your perspective on this is so valuable, and I've learned a lot from you about the tropics in particular and why you're focusing your work there. Can you frame the importance of that region for everyone in this room and speak to kind of the cascading ripple effect of a tropics that fails to adapt?
Yeah, I think when I say tropics, I think the image that comes to people's minds are tropical paradises, like villages where you go to spend the summer and the beach, and this is all true. You are all welcome to visit Barra Grande. I keep inviting people to come to Brazil, but and this is true. And it's also true that the tropics are one of the hottest regions on Earth. So every little increase in temperature matters, because we are already extremely warm, and an increase in temperature can mean acidification of the ocean. It can mean that the crops are changing because the rainy season is changing. And when you think about 1.5, we have to remember that 1.5 is the average, meaning that my region, for example, has already exceed. Yes. It has already exceeded this average. And there are regions that will have like 4 or 5 Celsius increase in temperature by the next decades. So the tropics, this is bad for the tropics, but this is also bad for the world, because the tropics, and we are not talking enough about it, the tropics are this first line of defense against the climate crisis. They are our airbag. They are our buffer. I have some data here to help me to show how the tropics are important. And the first one is that 80% of biodiversity is in the tropics. 80% of biodiversity is in less than 40% of the Earth's land. It's in the tropics. 43% of the world's population is in the tropics, and 85% of the poorest people on Earth are in the tropics. So we are talking here about an environmental problem combined with a social problem. There is this thing that we call the belt of poverty. There is this belt of poverty embracing our Earth, and they are in the tropics. What it means is that if the tropics reach this level that we call the limit of human adaptation, where people would go. So there are a lot of research showing that the tropics that fail to adapt will create this great waves of climate migration. There's even this data that I think it's shocking, that with every degree, 1 billion of people, 1 billion, is expected to be pushed for the zone where humans can live. In other words, it's just too hot to live. More than 50% of the species are in just 1.5% of the Earth, and 50% of the global risk for disease emergency is within 10% of the world's tropical forest. What does it mean is that the next pandemic is likely to come from the tropics, where there is this high interaction between biodiversity and sustainable urbanization. So in order to address or to prevent the next pandemic, the most effective measure is to protect tropical forests, is to regenerate nature. This pandemic costed us $2 trillion. With 1% of this, we could have this huge impact on preventing the next pandemic, and the best thing, it's the same solution to climate change. So it's good for everyone. And I feel that once you understand how the tropics are relevant for the world, it will be much easier to work in coalitions at different levels. I do not envision a coalition only for the tropics. I envision a coalition of people helping at different levels, because what we need now, it's not only this intergenerational solidarity, leaving a better earth for our kids. We also need now intercultural solidarity, interregional solidarity. How do we want to be for one another? How do we want to be humans in this changing climate?
And what does it mean for politics? David, you've spoken about your perspective on this, that the stress factors that Flavia is pointing to have huge societal and political implications, and that the pressures of that feel differently from the chair of a White House administration, for example. I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
This past year, 2 million individuals have attempted to cross the southern border into the United States. 2 million. That is the highest number on record. I remember our time during the Obama administrations, whenever there was an uptick of activity at the border, part of my job was to look at sentiment and then to do the analysis of what the effect was going to be, especially if we were going into an election season. And you would immediately see that once immigration rose to the top of salience in terms of an issue, think about political campaigns or a season around the campaign as being different battles around which issue is most salient at a given time. Depending upon what's salient, the Republicans have primacy on one set of issues, Democrats on another. When the earned media or the coverage focuses then on immigration, what we saw consistently is that the movement towards Republicans, towards conservatives, would rise. In qualitative, so when you would listen to the 8 to 12% of the electorate across the country who are call them swing voters or conflicted voters, and look, that's 10% of the country, of the electorate. So let's just say that's 20 to 25 million people who are engaged in watching. Once immigration would come, you would hear the following. I feel terrible that people need to make and are making the choices that they are. I understand it. But you know what? I'm struggling. I'm working 2 jobs. The pension that I counted on is gone. My health care is in question. We need to take care of ourselves. That was just the general reaction that would come. So, was there a variation on the theme? Of course, people are people. Now, play out what Flavia just described. The billion human beings in the tropics, in a climate-generated migration into the global north. We've seen the destabilization in democracies, not just in the United States, but if you look at Europe over the past 7 to 8 years, after the Syrian civil war resulted in a massive migration. Refugees from Afghanistan, the same thing. It begins to change the complexion of elections in Western democracy. This past week in Sweden, the Sweden Democrats, a party that 8 years ago was getting maybe 2%, just secured 21% in Sweden and will be a silent partner in the government. When you listen or look at the data as to what was the driving element, yes, there are core economic issues, but right underneath the surface and sometimes above it was a question of immigration and migration. You're seeing that in Italy right now. You're seeing it in Hungary with Orban. You saw it with Le Pen. You saw it with Farage in the United Kingdom. You see it everywhere. And so when I talked about the last mile, governments can do what they do in terms of climate, industry, and finance do their part. But if you ignore communities, especially in this area, and you don't focus as much attention on the Flavias who know those communities better than anyone else because they're there. And you have the best laws and the best engagement at a global level. What do you do? And let's just focus on Western democracies in the global north when these tensions arise. And what happens at that moment in time? This is why our politics, even if climate doesn't rise to the top 10 on a list of 30 issues, when you ask American voters what is of most importance, you know what does rise? Immigration, economic issues. And this is where, both in terms of persuasion, in message, and engagement, it's not a luxury or a nice to have to engage with someone who's working in the mangrove forests in northeast Brazil. It's a matter of urgency domestically in the United States. So that's the way, Eric, I try to tie them together.
Thank you so much for framing the social and political costs that underpin these issues. There are hard financial costs as well. Top-down solutions, which are effective, but they are expensive. Inaction is expensive. And there are local leaders on the ground, as you've alluded to, Flavia, who are already creating resiliencies. So I'm curious, how can we better evaluate the solutions landscape to effectively resource some of these on-the-ground actors? And Flavia, these are interventions that are high impact, low cost. I'm curious maybe if you could speak to some of the metrics on this, because I think that really drives the point home of the kind of resiliencies that are being created and could be lost.
Yes. I will speak about the metrics, but first I will take a step back and speak about the values that are guiding our decisions about where to invest. So the metrics are, I think you have been hearing this a lot during this climate week, is that we are trillions behind where we should be. We have been not investing enough. There's this data showing that we should invest 3.5 trillion every year. And in 2020, we invested just 600 billion. So there's not enough, and there are gaps in how we are investing this money. The first gap is the type of investment. People are much more likely to invest in cutting emissions, in cutting carbon emissions, in a new technology or new infrastructure. Because the value that is guiding this decision is that we need a new thing, a new product, a new service. We need to build more. We need to fix it. There is another value that is we can work in collaboration with nature and let nature do her work. And these values would guide decisions on adaptation. Adaptation is to support the nature and support communities and learn with them how they can better cope, how they can better adapt. But the gap is that 90% of climate fund goes to mitigation, not to adaptation. So this is the first level. The second level is that this funding is not reaching the local level. Only 10% of the fund that can be tracked, because it's super hard to track climate funding, but just 10% of those that can be tracked are reaching the local level. And in the local level, you see people who know more about the trade-offs, who can build trust with communities, who understand the hyper-local impacts of climate change. So this is the second level. And the third is the gender gap level. Only 0.2% of funding, of charity funding for climate goes to climate and gender, climate and the environment. And this is shocking, especially when you think about the impact women have on the ground, when you go to communities like mine, you see how women are this driving force. They are the stewards of biodiversity. They are holding families together, communities together. You can see, for example, that in South Asia and Africa, there are a lot of data showing how much food women produce. And if we give them the same resources as men, just by giving them the same resources, for example, land, they just hold 10% of the land, the smallholders farmer. If we give them the same resources, they can increase food production by 20 to 30%, and they can reduce hunger by 13%. So when I see this, I feel like there are this resource, and we have to unlock it. So I feel the problem is not that we lack money. I think there's a lot of money here. And I'm speaking now, I used to speak this before, but now I am in New York. Wow. There is a lot of money in this planet. We just need to make sure that we channel to where every dollar matters.
And David, what's the 30,000-foot view on that? How can governments, intergovernmental organizations, philanthropy, and the private sector support these kinds of interventions?
I didn't write down the statistic, and so forgive me if I butcher it. I promise I'm not going to make it up out of whole cloth. My wife is staring at me right now to say, don't do that. But I think in terms of global development money over the past few years, I think the statistic was out of $160 billion in global development aid, 16.5 million went to leadership capacity building. That's decimal dust. And the reason that's important is because it's an insight into a very top-down, mechanistic approach to aid. And in one way, what we heard in Africa when we selected our first class of African leaders, one young woman from Ghana said, I'm tired of people with wonderful intentions coming in and telling me how they're going to solve my problem. Stop it. So our entire approach is, you know, Brazil, we don't. That young woman in Ghana knows her community, we don't. And so what I would just urge everyone to do, especially around climate, is the recognition that, we have a lot going for us in the United States in terms of wealth, in terms of, even though it's under stress, social capital. Our responsibility not to use all of that in a top-down way that makes us feel good about our altruism and our generosity, but instead stepping back and to say to individuals and communities, how can we best be of service to you? Because you know we don't. And so if we can be in a place where we can fill a gap for you, and to, in some instances, be by your side, in most instances, be 3 or 4 steps behind, where you request to be maybe a step ahead, but driven by the determination you meet, is a mindset, especially in climate, which can be a massive abstraction to people, but not for Flavia in her community. And so that's also the same approach domestically. I have yet to see anyone persuaded to change their opinion about anything by being told they're bad. Even if you believe it to your core.
Thank you, David. I would like to, on that note, return to the idea of coalitions. And I'm reminded of a story. I feel I've heard President Obama referred to it on a number of occasions, his early community organizing days in Chicago, and listening, that his first task was just to listen to constituents, and hear about their individual experiences, and he noticed right away that there were through lines between all of these conversations, and that, as he refers to it, the community existed but was unaware of itself. And so coalition building is at the heart of the Obama Foundation. It's at the heart of what you're doing, Flavia. I'd be really interested in your perspectives on how to unearth the global community that exists and may be unaware of itself through coalition building. Start with you.
Yeah. Coalition building is not the easiest thing on earth. I'm not gonna lie. Yeah. Because coalition building is about communicating to connect instead of communicating to blame or to shame or to polarize. It's about hearing what people say and how they say it. It's about finding their needs, and based on their needs, finding how they can be moved in the shared mission of climate justice. For me, on the ground, when I arrived in Barra Grande, the village that I live now, I started with no agenda. I didn't have a plan. I was doing the Obama Scholars Program online. I was just living the community and being part of it and channeling their needs in a way that I felt like I was mostly absorbing everything. And having this training, this capacity, because this is very hard, of deep listening. Because we have been hearing a lot. We have to include the voices of the marginalized. But do we know how to do this? How to include their voices? Are we there to maybe center their voices instead of just including? Because I'm not the center, and maybe they have something that I can learn with. So I feel community building it requires emotional intelligence. And we need to put an effort on it. Not only because it's important for coalition building, but it's important for climate change. Climate change is a crisis in communication, it's a crisis in imagination, it's a crisis in relationships. We have to heal our relationships with others, with ourselves, with Earth. Otherwise, we will keep attacking the symptoms of the problem. Emissions are the symptom. Emotions are the root causes. So I feel that coalition building, although it's not the easiest thing to do, it's the most effective thing to do. And this is not like something nice that I would do because I am enlightened. I will communicate, I will be nonviolent, I will create coalitions in climate justice. It's not just because it's right, it's not just because it's ethical, it's not just because it's fair, it's because it is the most effective strategy, even economically. It's because there is a cost effectiveness on it. I feel like if we were a corporation, if the Earth was a corporation and we had to do these ESG things, we are not doing a very good job with the SG, with the SG part of the ESG. So I think coalitions are about this. It's about social, it's about the governance pillars of climate action.
Yes, and I understand how challenging it is to actually build robust ones, but they're rooted in shared mission and shared sentiment, which we're human beings, we're all connected. We have those seeds among us all the time. And David, I'm curious about how the Obama Foundation approaches coalition building.
It's community organizing 101, and so the four component parts, and forgive me if those of you in the room have already heard these before, and so indulge me with your patience. Issue mapping, power mapping, asset inventory, and narrative. You care about something, what is it? Map the issue, not just climate, but the component parts of it, and what is the thing that you have the most passion for, in engagement with. That becomes your lens. Power mapping. Work backwards from what a solution looks like. What would be the conditions that would have to be in place in order for the solution to occur? Who's the decision maker or decision makers? What are their incentives? Because they all have them. How do they think of power? Legal, reputational, regulatory, political, every facet of it. Know it. Because you're going to confront it at some point, so you better prepare up front. Asset inventory. Once you've done the first two pieces, all right, this is addition, not subtraction. Who are the people in organizations that I need to build in a strategic way in terms of assets that can be aligned against the incentives within power, relationships, elections, financing, that you can deploy in a strategic way, in narrative. The story that I tell has to be authentic in every instance, but it needs to be tailored in a very specific way to the people I'm engaging with at a specific time, place, and manner. Flexibility there, rigidity in terms of first principles. These are all of the elements that go into then the necessity to engage in coalition building and organizing. And so I love this stuff. Could talk about it forever. I won't.
Because that's my plant in the audience has just told me we're at time. So it's a good transition. We do have a few minutes for questions from the audience, if anyone has anything for David or Flavia. Yes?
My name is Simas and I work for a company named Airshot now. And I've been in the carbon world for ages, since 2007. In the carbon markets, very specifically, nature solutions. And I do see that many things have changed ever since. We've seen an exponential in the market. But today, I mean, this has been super inspiring to me to hear. I was in a number of meetings today, and one of the things that I have noticed that hasn't changed, at least in the carbon markets, is that the global north is still making the decisions. And we think that we know best. So how can we involve, how can we hear the voice of the global south to make things work? Because I don't think we can do it. I know that it's at a community level, but when we're making decisions at political level, how can we, I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can involve the other part, like the people that are most affected.
Thank you for your question, Cecilia. What I feel is that when the global north is interested in knowing more about the mangroves restoration, what I experienced is that some people want to know, for example, what is the best area to restore, how much carbon this area could capture, what are the conditions that will serve our interest in creating blue carbon credit. And all of this is very important, and I think communities can help with this knowledge, but communities can also help with wisdom. So when you think about selling carbon, this is a way of thinking that sometimes some communities do not relate with. Creating an economic argument to restore mangroves, because mangroves are not resources for some of us. In my community, for example, the women see mangroves as having an agency. So we are in relationship with the mangroves. The mangroves, we experience them and they experience us. So I feel when I think about including these tropical communities and the global south in this conversation, is also be willing to decolonize the conversation and having these discussions about values and not only about what is instrumental to who is interested in mangroves restoration.
And the only thing I would add is incentives matter. Incentives drive behavior, from my perspective. And so imagine, and I'll give you a very quick example, anyone who contracts with us, there are certain requirements, like you want to do business with us, great, we want your business, but what are you doing in terms of the recruitment of staff members and other people from communities that have not been traditionally included? How are you doing now? And if you're not doing very well right now, what is the plan that you're going to be executing on? Once you can show us that, you do business with us. There's a lot of money that now is engaged in the climate world. And you're seeing incentives being set up in a variety of different ways in terms of investments. Imagine that that becomes one of the pillars or becomes one of the driving elements to say, okay, if you're going to make these investments, X has to be done in Y type of community based upon an adaptation framework that is more meaningful to people. And so, I mean, just go back 15 years in 2007 and think about just the amazing work that's been done and reverse engineer some of those incentives and then apply them into what you'd like to see over the course of the next 10 years. So that's the way I would think about that tangible problem. Always begin with, what are the incentives that are going to drive behavior? So, but thank you for your question. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more. Yep.
Hi everyone, Rachel Ramirez, and I'm with CNN. I'm just wondering, first, I guess, David, how do we continue that momentum in terms of political will? With the recent passage of the IRA, it seems like we're going in the right direction. But what happens when a new administration comes in, when a new Congress comes in? How do we navigate that sort of, pendulum of, politics? And I guess for Flavia, what is the role of coalitions and communities in that kind of navigation? I know that's sort of more of a domestic thing, but.
Policy windows open infrequently. When they do, you take advantage of them the way this administration has done right now. That creates new constituencies of interest based upon when the investments begin to flow. Incentives begin to change. Politics begins to change. And one of the interesting things that I've seen in many communities, essentially, is that if you know that there's been a series of investments that flow from any piece of legislation, all of a sudden, as we have seen with the Affordable Care Act, the rhetoric in the policy choices and the voting choices among people who previously were opposed to it begin to shift. But you need to be intentional about aligning that. So healthcare reform in the United States versus climate investments in the United States, very, very different just in the way people receive them, but the underlying political approach is the same, right? It's like, okay, this has occurred, it creates a constituency. Politics builds around the constituency, and therefore, from a climate community, what do you need to do now with a member of Congress who may have been opposed, like on infrastructure, where after the infrastructure bill passed, everyone who voted against it was issuing press releases saying how wonderful the new bridge was in their district. That's reality. The same approach in climate begins to, I think, there's an opportunity there. So.
I can only speak about my own experience in government. I will not speak about the US politics, but I worked for the government for more than 10 years in my state, Piauí, and I learned that our possibility of action goes beyond voting. Citizenship is more than voting, and governments often follow what communities are doing, what communities are already transforming. So I think this is why I am passionate about community organizing. I think there is a lot that we can do as communities, and governments are one of the actors But we have to remember that society and the private sector together are the puzzle. Like, these are the pieces of the puzzle.
Barney?
So Flavia, with significant capital, how in your local community would you deploy change?
Thank you, Barney. We are now in the stage of fundraising. We fundraised in Antarctica, seed funding, and we now have 18 women trained on climate justice, and we have this power map of what's the spaces that we need to be representing climate action. And we mapped all the mangroves of our region, and we know that we now have to restore mangroves in 300 hectares. And I feel that this solution is very low cost when you compare with these big solutions on infrastructure, on technology. So just to give you a sense, we are planning to raise over the next 5 months, $500,000. And with this, we can restore mangroves. We can have this component on climate justice and gender equality. We can educate girls, and we can communicate climate change to the locals and to the globe. We can also have this research and innovation component, so we are sure that our intervention is sustainable. So I feel that this is as acting at the leverage of a system. We don't have to move mountains. We can pollinate. This is what nature does. Connections and this soft approach. There is this indigenous leader in Brazil who says, he told me, step softly on earth, pisa suavemente na terra. So I feel Filha do Sol has this approach of reverence to nature, of understanding not only what's wrong and trying to fix it, but what's right and how we can flow in collaboration with it. And with a small investment, what huge impact we can make.
I love the idea of pausing on what's right. And Andrew, who this is slow down his space. I worked in this space for many years. Andrew often talks about some of the through lines we've been following here tonight, that you don't inspire people to make change by telling them what's wrong. And I personally, I know we're nearing the end of our time here, but I feel galvanized to have had a conversation with both of you about what equitable, impactful, inclusive climate solutions are out there that with just a little leverage can be exponentialized. And I don't think it's belaboring the point to bring it back to coalitions. I think coalitions can take shape anywhere. And they can happen on the decks of an ocean liner in the Southern Ocean, or in Barra Grande, or in rooms like this. So I want to thank you all for being here tonight. And I invite you to take a moment to connect more deeply with the mission at hand, whatever shape that may take. And I want to sincerely thank you both for your time and your thoughts tonight.
Obrigada.